The last group of artists we're going to talk about today are the Symbolists. The Symbolists are an art movement that really gets their feet under them in the 1890s, and often are seen as kind of a bridge between what's happening at the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. These artists are more international and less unified than either the Impressionists or the Post-Impressionist movement, so we see Symbolist artists from all over Europe, and some of them from America as well. And what these artists really have in common is that they paint largely using their imagination, and they choose imaginative subjects. Many of them, although not all of them, feature quite terrifying or horrifying subject matter. And so we see a little bit of a return to that early 19th century and the kind of horror, macabre tastes that we saw in Romanticism. But not all Symbolist painters are kind of as horrific as the Romantics. And sometimes these painters could be quite cheerful as well. So, Audouin Redon, who's a French painter, is a good example of this. On one hand, there's a certain amount of horror here. We see this giant one-eyed monster, the Cyclops, who gazes down at this sleeping female figure. But on the other hand, he doesn't seem particularly dangerous or particularly threatening. He has a kind of goofy grin on his face. And some art historians have suspected that this is meant to depict the legend of Galatea, that he's actually in love with this woman. But regardless, obviously the Cyclops isn't real, giants aren't real, so this is coming from Redon's imagination. And Redon himself was encouraged by his father from childhood to think and to use his imagination in a way that we would consider very modern today, and the end result is these somewhat unusual paintings. Probably the most famous Symbolist artist is Edvard Munch, and Munch is Norwegian, although much of his successful artistic career takes place in Paris and then later Berlin before he finally returns to Norway. And easily his most famous painting is this one, The Cry or The Scream. Your book uses the title The Cry, which is why I use that title on this slide as well. This is one of 4 versions of this painting that's become an international sensation. But what we see here is very typical of Munch's paintings. Munch's life was quite difficult in many ways. His mother died when he was quite young, as did one of his beloved older sisters from tuberculosis. And his father was extremely religious, something of a religious fanatic, so he had quite a harsh childhood. And Munch himself was quite ill. He was unwell for much of his childhood and kept home and in bed a lot. So kind of, again, an overactive and nervous child. As he grew up, he initially went to a technical university, but then he left that school to go to art school. And like I said, he has a successful artistic career in both Berlin and Paris before returning to Norway as an internationally recognized artist. But paintings like these have to do with feelings that he often describes in his letters and in his diaries as feeling alone or feeling isolated, even in the midst of a crowd. The particular diary entry that describes this painting, which is in your book, describes him feeling this kind of cry or scream reverberating through the atmosphere as he's walking down the street one evening with several of his friends. And what we see in many of Munch's paintings is this feeling of kind of isolation or loneliness, even in intensely populated cities or in the face of large crowds. Many of Munch's figures seem kind of zombie-like to us. They have similar features, they don't seem to really be differentiated from each other, and they seem to relentlessly march on towards us. We can see some of that in the 2 background figures here in this painting. And Munch himself did suffer what was at the time called a nervous breakdown in his 40s and spent a couple of years in a mental institution. But here again we can see the inner life or this inner imagination of the artist really playing out in his work and in his pictures. Symbolist artists adopt a more realist style. So Gustave Moreau both was a painter and a draftsman. He also did printmaking, and many of his works were used to illustrate books. And here we see a slightly old-fashioned take. Moreau is showing us in this painting called The Apparition, a biblical story. We see Salome dancing before Herod, and as she does so, before her appears this image of the severed head of John the Baptist. So this is a biblical story, and one we have seen in at least a couple of pictures before, but Moreau himself was obsessed with this subject. He made almost 40 different paintings and a large number of drawings that were on this subject. And what's different about this than earlier versions of the story that we've seen is that this doesn't appear to be that kind of aftermath of the story of Salome, but as she's in the midst of the story, as she's dancing for Herod, she seems to have this kind of imaginative vision, this apparition, as the title references, of what is going to happen. So, again, I think we can see the connections to Romanticism, and we can see the connections to this kind of inner life or psyche that's so important to the Symbolists.